All right. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, and good night to all of you out there in the world, wherever you happen to be. My name is Voice of Wind, and today we're not gaming. We're doing something just a little bit different, and I'm fighting with my computer, which is exactly what we would expect. That's the norm, right? So let me take just a moment to bring things up. There we go. All right, hello. Let me move that a little out of the way. There's no good place for any of this stuff. That's okay. Hopefully that comes through. That's good enough. All right. I'm not going to be on camera all that much today. I just wanted to say hi to you and to kind of describe what's going to go on today so that you've got a clear idea of what's going on. I thought we would do something a little bit different. I want to do a sewing stream. I know that not everyone is ready to start drafting their own patterns yet. So I want to go through that process with you. But what I really want to do today is show you the process of taking maybe one of your favorite garments. For me, that happens to be some PJ pants, some pajama pants. And I know that that's important for some of you out there because you're like me. The pandemic hit, COVID hit, and work decided that they didn't need you in the office anymore. And so, I think I'm like a whole lot of other people. I want to be comfortable while I'm at work. And that means that most of my pajamas have worn out. Most of my comfier clothes are wearing out. And so I'm going to take one of my favorite pair of PJs, which has developed a hole, and I'm going to make a copy of them. I can't fathom the price that we put on some of the goods that we purchase, especially when like a pair of pajama bottoms can run you $20 to $30 at, say, Target. At Walmart even, they're $10 for a pair that is poorly constructed, doesn't last very long, and why would we pay for that if we can get a lot more for a whole lot less? So that's kind of what I want to go over today. And depending on the reception of this stream and how it goes, I'll do more of this stuff. So let's take a look at what we're working with today, and then we'll kind of go into the actual process for making the pattern. And this will probably be a two-part stream. The first one, we'll make the actual pattern, and we'll lay that pattern out onto the fabric. And then off stream, I'll cut the fabric. And then tomorrow, we'll go through and actually sew the garment together. So I'm just going to tilt the camera down, and we'll get into it. What all do we have here? What do we actually need for sewing, right? So I have a pattern that I've made previously, and you can kind of see it's very simple. It's just freezer paper. And you probably have freezer paper in your own house. And if you don't, you probably have some butcher's paper or something similar. And if you don't, I highly recommend picking some up. It even says right on the box that it is useful. If my camera would focus, it's not going to focus. But right on the box, it says it's used for arts and crafts. And we're going to use it for just that purpose. We're also going to need a pair of scissors for cutting this. And this is where I turn into a bit of a snob. I have a different pair of scissors for cutting things like paper than I do for cutting my fabric. And the reason for that is that fabric tends to snag. And you don't want to have snags in your fabric. So I do keep a separate pair of scissors for my fabrics and a separate pair for everything else. So these blue scissors that I've got are utility scissors. I use them in the kitchen. I use them all over the house. I use them for paper. Paper, especially this, is plastic coated. It also has clay in it. That's how paper gets its rigidity. And that means that scissors like this tend to lose their edge quickly. And so I always keep a different pair of scissors for fabric as opposed to everything else. And that's very important where sewing is concerned. Outside of that, we have some basic needles and something to hold the needles. You don't have to have one of these tomatoes for holding needles, but they're helpful. I have a basic ruler that's just retractable. I do have a chalk roller, and this is really useful for drawing little lines on that you can erase later. But there's also fabric markers and all kinds of other ways of marking fabric. I know people that have also used like Crayola magic markers that are washable, but make sure that you test things like that first. Do a test on a small corner of the fabric, wash it off, make sure it's not going to leave a permanent stain on something like that. For the pattern that we're actually going to make, I'm going to use some permanent markers so that you can see what we're doing a little bit easier. And as we go, I'm also going to pull up a display capture for us, and I'm just going to briefly go over the process in Paint so that you can see that on screen with, you know, a different way of seeing things. I know that not everyone learns the same way, and so I want to have a couple of different ways to see it. So outside of that, I do have this specialized ruler. I know it's a little difficult to see, but if I get the light on it, you can see that one side is curved. And this curve is kind of graduated as it goes. And that's going to be helpful a little bit later. I'll show that. And then the last piece that we'll use at the very end is just some elastic. This is a knit elastic. It kind of keeps from rolling, but that's not all that important. We'll go over why the elastic later on, but that's basically for the waistline. So we'll go into that a little later. It is Pride Month, and so coming out, introducing yourself, and embracing yourself is super important. So congratulations on exploring that. And we are all happy to meet you and happy to see you here. And we will still refer to you as Rubix in chat. So one of the things I was discussing is that, okay, so one of the things that I was talking about is the cost of these things, right? So these are the PJs that I'm going to make a copy of, and I don't remember exactly how much these cost. They were probably somewhere in the neighborhood of $20, I want to say. They were probably a Target special. Maybe I purchased them online. I don't remember, but when we consider that that was probably somewhere in that neighborhood, I went to Joann's a couple of weeks ago and I used a coupon. And when I used that coupon, I got all of this fabric for under $20. And there's enough fabric here. I believe that I got either 2.5 or 3 yards of each of these, fabrics here for about $18. And I also got some elastic and the thread, just a black thread that's going to work with all of these for the same price as one pair of PJs. So I'm going to end up making 3 pairs of pajamas for the same price as one. And it's going to take me not all that long. We're going to take one afternoon to make a pattern, and then I'm going to use that same pattern to make 3 pairs of pajamas. So that's our goal. Hello, Keelier. Good to see you. I hope you're doing well. So I'm going to set the fabrics aside for a moment because we're going to go into the pattern itself. I'm going to move the fabric scissors just so I'm not tempted to grab them by accident. Okay, so for the pattern itself, there's a couple of things that we want to look at in terms of PJ pants, right? So they're very, very simple. And this is one of the reasons that I wanted to start with this pattern. All right, so for pants like this, you can kind of see that the pants themselves have an almost straight edge along the outside edge, right? And I'll try to keep this in frame. I don't get the whole table here, but the outside edge of the leg is near straight, and we'll verify that when we actually take a closer look at them. The inside leg is where things get a little more interesting, right? So we have a gusset here for the crotch because we have to fit these in 3D, right? So the legs are done flat and then they have to curl in for the legs. And so this is where that crotch setup is. And so we've got a curve here, and that's where our ruler is going to come in handy. So we've got a little bit of a curve here, and we also have a little bit of a curve here as we come up to the waistline. The waist itself, if I take a look at this waist, it looks like it's curved, right? But it's actually not. So if I take the waist and stretch it just a little bit, you can see that it really ends up making almost a straight line. And we can verify that if we want to by undoing the seams in this, taking out all of the stretch, the elastic inside of this waistband to verify that it's straight. But I know from experience that this is probably straight. It's a straight edge. And the other thing that we'll need to know for making this pattern is that anytime we sew two seams together, whether that be a side seam and a top seam, or whether that be an inside seam to an inside seam, right? So this middle seam coming up the center to a leg seam, I need to have right angles. And so if we look at the very middle of the crotch, which is really difficult to see on camera, but it ends up making almost a cross pattern because it's 4 pieces of fabric all coming together. And in order to get those pieces to come together, the easiest way to do that is on a square. So we want to look for 90 degrees when we do all of this stuff. So one of the questions that we're going to ask ourselves as we make this pattern is, as I make a curve for the leg, how do I keep a 90-degree edge where seams meet? So that's going to be our big question. And then the next question is, if I don't take these apart, how do I make a copy of it? So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take these and turn them inside out. And I'm going to turn them inside out because there's a little bit of extra fabric on the inside of these seams. I don't know how well you can see that. I'm not so good at walking it up. But you can see that there's a little bit of extra fabric curled on there, right at the seam. And I want to capture that extra fabric. So in sewing, that's generally called a seam allowance. And we want to build that into our pattern as much as we can. So now taking a look at the inside of this, I can see that the waistband has been folded over and sewn closed, and that's where that elastic is held in. So one of the things I want to remember when I make this pattern is that I want to have extra room for this waistband to be folded over. So however wide I make this waistband, I want to make sure that I've got enough fabric extra on top to fold over. The same is going to be true for the bottom of the leg, right? So the bottom of the leg here has some extra that's been folded up for the hem at the bottom of the leg, and that's been sewn on as well. So at the bottom of the leg, I want to include some extra length so that we've got a little room for the hemline there as well. And that's also going to make sure that I get the length that I want on these, right? Nysterix says, a seam allowance is the area between the fabric edges and the line of stitches. Seam allowances range from a 1/4 inch wide to as much as several inches, and most patterns call for a specific seam allowance. If your seams are not accurate, you may run out of fabric, or the pieces may not line up correctly. And that is absolutely true. So it looks like in this garment, this was serged, so the seam allowance is very, very small. So we're going to end up adding a little bit more to that so that we can make sure our seams do in fact line up. So I'm going to add on about a 1/2 inch to these seams, and that will give us, in theory, about 5/8 of a seam allowance. And that's the standard seam allowance in American patterns. Why 5/8? I don't really know, but that's what I'm going to go for. So as I lay out this leg, I want to keep in mind whether it's the front or the back, because that may make a difference in terms of some of the gussets. Specifically this area right here where the two legs meet at the center. Because you're going to have a little extra room in the back for the backside, the butt, than you will for the front. Wi-Fi vase, because we have trouble letting go of the Imperial measurement system. That is absolutely correct. Okay, so taking a look now at this waistband, I just want to ensure if I stretch this out, I'm pretty sure that we can all agree that it makes a rectangle in terms of this seam, and the rest of it. So I'm just going to guess that that's a rectangle, and I'm not going to worry about it. So then the areas I do need to worry about are going to be this middle seam, this curve, and the outside leg. I can tell, looking at it, that the leg does get thinner as we go to the bottom, but at the bottom, it straightens out. And it doesn't have to be perfectly straight. Maybe it does get a little bit thinner graduating as we go, but I don't have to worry about that too much because I can customize it a little bit with the pattern later on, right? So when I make them, if I want this area to be a little bit cuffed in, we can always just take it in after it's sewn, right? So the pattern itself, I'm not too worried about this area as much as I am this area. So I'm just trying to get this top area to flatten out a bit. And I know that this area is going to bunch up, so I won't worry about it as much. I just want to get the rest flattened so that I can get this curve. And I'm not going to get this curve with this other leg hanging off the table, right? So here, I can fold it in half. And I can just focus on getting this curve. And if I can't quite get there, I can tug on the fabric a little bit till I find that seam. Manipulate the fabric a little bit till it is truly flat. And this will give me something to work with. There we go. Now, I know that some people, when they do this, will end up putting one leg inside of the other, and that's also a viable option. So you would take one inside out, and then you would fold this so that this leg is inside of this leg, and that can make things easier. It can also make things more difficult. But now I think you can start to see that I've got the shape that I need for this. And now we can kind of see these shapes that we need. And again, if this was a pair of PJs that I was willing to get rid of, at this point, you could just say, you know what? This is the pattern, and you could cut right down the seams, and you'd have a pattern done, right? So we could go with that too. But I want to hold on to these PJs for a bit longer and show you how to do that without destroying them just yet. So now that I've got it laid out, I'm going to get some paper. And again, this is just standard freezer paper. I think I picked this up at the grocery store. It's 18 inches wide, which is 475 millimeters wide, apparently, because more of that Imperial system. And I think that you can pick these up at the store for like $3, which is way cheaper than pattern paper. And I'm just going to lay it out at about the length that I want. And again, I don't have to have this the full length of the leg because I'm going to add more onto the leg. So I don't have to have the full length for it, right? Because I can just leave a note on my pattern of add 8 inches or add 10 inches, right? So I don't have to have the full length for the leg if I'm not going to capture the full leg. I could just do it to about here and then do a straight line for the rest of the leg, adding on the extra 10, 15 inches that it needs. So I think that's about what I'm going to do. Now, the problem with freezer paper, of course, is that it likes to curl. So you can use weights on it as well. You could use a candle or your water glass or something like that to help weigh it down. I'm hoping that our PJs are going to be heavy enough for that. There we go. Excellent. So I will give it just a little bit of weight here and there. And I'm going to grab a pencil just to mark out major areas of concern, right? So this line here is about where the top starts to pull in. So I'm going to set that mark for me just so that I know where to stop copying this pattern and where I'm going to have to draft it myself. So that's about here. So I'm going to make that mark. And I'm just marking a little ways outside of the seam. It doesn't have to be exact for this, but it needs to be close enough, right? And then just at a couple of points along the way, I'm just going to put a couple of marks right outside the seam. And then at actual corners, I'm going to mark an X, and that's going to tell me where I need to have my 90-degree angles. And if it helps, feel free to flatten out your fabric along the way and make sure it lines up with all those dots that you've just placed down. Okay, and I'm going just to this line. I'm using my arm here kind of as a balance so that if I give a gentle tug on the seam, the rest doesn't move. Just to make sure that I'm still nice and flat. So this is the line where I'm going to add extra inches. And I know that this side is mostly flat, so I'm not going to get up and go around the table for it. Because that can be done as a straight line. So now from here, this is the area, this line is where we're going to look at the actual shape of what this made. And I think we said it was a rectangle, right? Or a square, because it's going to square off at the top. So just to verify that, if I bring this edge to about where it should be, which looks to be about here if I'm following the seam line. So I'm just giving a gentle tug so that this is not pulling. This area here is not pulling. And not worrying about the waistband itself. So I can almost tug the rest of it over so that this seam line lies flat. And by doing that, I can finish out this seam. I'll mark the top, And we know we're going to add extra to the top. So I need to remember that. And then the other side, I'm just going to mark where the top goes to, right? So about that same idea. I'm just going to mark about where the top is. They're going to make a 90-degree angle, and it's going to be flat across the top. So I'm not going to worry too much about that. And we're going to have a straight line here, so I don't need to worry too much about that either. So from there, I can start doing curves. That's the basic pattern for the back. So there's a couple of things I can do now. I can mark this as the back. Right? And I need to add a distance to this. Well, what distance do I need to add? This is one of the reasons that we brought that ruler earlier. I measured myself earlier. If I measure from my waist, which is about where I want this to sit, down to the bottom of the leg, I have a 40-inch outseam. This from the waistline down to the marking that we stopped at is about 29 inches. To get that to 40 inches then, I need to add about 11 inches, right? But I also want to keep that hem in mind. And I don't want it to be too short. So I'm going to give myself a little extra allowance. And I'm going to add 14 inches. And that might seem like a little much, but when we add in the top and it scrunches up and it pulls up on your waist just a little bit, you might want that extra room. And we can always make them shorter, but we can't really make them longer. And I want to verify that on the inside seam too. So my inseam is 32 inches. And with this ruler, I can kind of curl things and get a rough idea. So the inseam here is about 16 inches. 16 from 32 is 16. So this would really be too short if I only added 14 inches, but I know that these hang down a little bit. They've got a little extra room, right, in this area. So I think 14 inches is going to be okay for the outseam, right? So maybe we do 15 inches just to be really safe. So I'm going to add 15 inches, oops, not 15 hashtags, 15 inches at the bottom. Right? So there's that. And now I want to look at the straight edges and the corners on the curves. So this is where that ruler we had comes into play. Right? So we figured out that the top is straight, roughly, and maybe we can hold off on the top for just a moment and take a look at the side. And we can get that roughly dialed in. So that's about a straight line there. And I'm just going to sketch that in. And by doing so, I can get that line all the way up to the top. There we go. So there's our outseam. Stay put. Then for our inseam, it starts out straight and then curves. So I'm going to look for the approximate location of that curve. And I'm just going to kind of fill it in as best I can, with the knowledge that this has to be 90 degrees. That's where this curves the ruler's edge is going to come in. So I'm going to use that to create 90 degrees right at the center here, where I drew my X. That guarantees that I'm going to have that nice seam when I come in later. And then I can find approximately where that seam is. It looks about like that, so we can fill in that part. And then it kind of softens. And then it flattens out. And then again, this top edge, in order for it to make a perfect seam, it has to be 90 degrees at all sides. But you just saw me come in here at an angle. So this is where we're going to finagle things a little bit. So I'm going to come right up on this corner and get my 90 degrees. These are not quite the same height. So I'm going to come up to 90 degrees with the top of this one. Right about there. Okay. That's good. And then on the other side, I'm going to mark down 90 degrees from the top, and then just angle out from there to come in line with the seam that we've got. So we can use these same curves again to come in line with it. Hello, Thalassa! Thank you for the raid. How are you today? So something like that. And then we have our line coming across the top. So with these in place, I know that I want to add room to the top. And we also need to get the inside of the leg. So there's the outer leg. I can fill in now for the seam that lines up the two legs. Right? And now we can do the top. Now remember, for the top, we need to add in enough for elastic, right? So I need to account for that. How are you, Thalassa? What did you end up playing today? Were you still taking over the world? Hello, Trinity. Good to see you. So the elastic I'm planning for this is about 1 inch wide. So I want to account for that and add a little bit more, right? So I want to add about 2 inches to the top of my waistband. And since the top and the bottom are going to be at 90-degree angles, all of this is going to be flat. So that should work out pretty nicely. So I'm going to draw this in. Right, so there's my straight line there. Not feeling great because you couldn't get much sleep. Oh, that's unfortunate. Hopefully you can make up for it tonight. So the last piece that I want to add in then here is this inside seam on the leg. So again, we need this 90-degree angle, which we've already done previously. So I just need to find the curve for the marks that we did earlier. And of course you could freehand this, and there's nothing wrong with freehanding it. I think it just looks a little bit nicer and a little bit easier if we've got a marking device for it, which is why I keep the ruler handy. That looks about right. And again, I want this to come in, or I want this to come down at about 90 to the bottom of the leg. So if I look at the bottom here and just make sure that things are squared off for that 15-inch add on the bottom, this will be easier to pattern out onto the fabric itself. So this will come in to about there. So now we have our basic pattern. So what things do we still need here? Well, I think that there's a couple of things that we could probably add. The first is seam allowance. And we talked about that at the beginning. So the 2 inches at the top and the 15 inches at the bottom, I'm not going to worry about. You took over the world and you're now playing Dragon Quest XI. Wow. Yeah, Searing, we're working on PJ bottoms. So for this side, this is just a straight line, right? And this ruler, having it be see-through is really, really nice because I can just get my 5/8 inch seam allowance roughly dialed in. Right around there. And then the same kind of thing for this side. For the curves, we can again just do little dots. For that seam allowance. Right. And then if I just use the ruler to look at where I had it lined up on the curve before, I can just kind of bring it out to the same spot and dial in the same set here. And again, these are just PJ bottoms, so it doesn't have to be perfect. It would just be nice if it was close, right? So here we're continuing that 90. There we go. So there's our seam allowance for the inside. And our seam allowance for the outside. We're going to add 15 inches to the bottom. We're going to add 2 inches to the top. And then the other thing that we need that was missing, and it seems to always be missing from the best PJs, is pockets. Where are the pockets? Right? So I need to make a spot for pockets. So one of the things that I've already done, and this is one of the easier patterns to do, is I've made a pocket pattern. And really, it's just a rectangle. So I'm not going to make a pocket pattern here on stream, unless you really want me to. We can go over that. But in essence, what I did is I made this rectangle, right? And then I added on this little edge and made a curve on it. And then I made a curve here. So your hand would go in this section, and all of your stuff would be down in this area. Now, how big do you make the pocket? Well, for me personally, if my hand is going in where the candle is at, my pocket needs to be this big, right? It's got to fit my phone. So I've got a little note on here that says plus 3 inches to the bottom. And so if my phone sits about 3 inches down, it sits right there. And this is the perfect size pocket to hold my phone and maybe a chapstick or a marker or whatever I need to hold, right? And then I can walk around the house in my PJs and carry everything I need to run my life or take over the world, right? So that's the basic pocket pattern. There's nothing special to it, right? So this one in particular is about 5 5/8 inch wide, 7 inches at the widest point, because that's where the hand goes in, right? And then the height on it is 12 inches when you've got the extra 3 inches at the bottom. Okay, so that takes care of pocket and back. Let's take a look at the front. And I'm unrolling this again because I want to see if the front is the same as the back. And if it's not the same as the back, I want to see how it's different. Because maybe I can reuse this pattern in some way. So this is the back where the tag is at. So if I take a look at the front, let me fold these in half so I can get a better look at just one leg. And I want to isolate it again right to where the legs meet. I'm going to line it up to the same spot. And what I can tell immediately is that the front of these pants is in a different spot than the back of the pants, or at least I've given them different room, right? And so why is it this way? Well, there's two reasons that it could be this way. The first is that I misjudged the top, and there is a curve in here that we're not seeing, which would mean that the back of these sits a little higher than the front of them, which would kind of make sense, right? If you have, a little bit lower in the front to make room for the butt. The other reason that it could be that way, and the actual reason for it, if we take a look, is that this length specifically for the front seam is shorter than the distance for the back. And you could verify this by measuring it. Let's take a look. So just this length. Is roughly 12 inches, right? And I could bring that up to the camera, but hopefully you'll trust me that it's roughly 12 inches. And if we look at the back, where we've made room for the butt, it's closer to 14 inches, maybe even 15 with the curve. So that's where that distance is at, right? So, can we account for that in this pattern? Well, let's take a look at the curve itself. Let me try and get this lined up in the same way that we did for the backside. So I'm going to give a little bit of a tug from underneath so that I can isolate these seams just like we did before. So what I'm looking at on top is nice and flat, because that's what matters. So we know that we're about 2 or 3 inches shorter here, which makes sense. It looks like, if this is a straight line, that the legs are the same width. Right? Lay this leg out and lay one on top. If I line this up, okay, so the bottom of the legs now, hopefully you can see this on camera, this line is identical. This curve at the bottom of the leg is identical. And this outseam on the leg is identical. And that probably means that these tops are identical too. So the only difference then is that the back of the leg has a little more room to it than the front of the leg. And we have to account for that somehow. So the front has 2 inches less than the back does. So, how can we account for that? Well, the easiest way is going to be to add in a curve. And there's a couple of ways that we could go about that, but I think we may need another piece of paper. And we don't need an entirely new piece of paper, right? Because we're only adjusting a little bit. We're only adjusting this section, right? So there may be a way to do this without redoing the whole thing and making an entirely new sheet of paper. So, given now what we know, that the top seam, or the back seam, in the center is longer, and it has to meet the front seam, we can add a curve along the top to make them meet. But what I'm first going to do is just leave myself a little mark on this one. And this is just pencil, so I can erase it later if I need to, but it's just a little mark that tells me that's where the front is, right? Because the rest is identical.
Remember all the happy times we had?
So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at my original pattern. And I made this one a few months ago from the same PJs. And I just want to take a look and see what I came up with back then. And it's about the same. It's a rough sketch, but just checking. Yeah, I didn't make them quite as wide, but I was hoping I could reuse this, and it doesn't look like I'll be able to. So that's okay. So the way that I want to address this then, I had originally made a mark here, and this mark I had marked as the top of the back, if you recall.
I'll tell you the truth.
And so I think that that actually was the top of the back. And that means then that this is also the top of the front on the outseam. And so one of the things that we can do then is set a curve in it. And I'm just going to do a very, very basic curve. Put a little bit of weight there. So from here, I want to come out at 90 degrees. And I just gently want to curve up. At about the halfway point, I want to be about halfway up to there. Something like that. And then the same on the reverse. Like that. There we go. So then the curve for the front is pretty much identical, right? If you're confident doing so, you could almost have them on the same piece of paper. That's going to be difficult to do though, because then you'd end up having to fold it over and drawing this curve in on your other set of PJs. So instead, it may just be easier to use another sheet of paper. And like I said, this paper is relatively inexpensive, so I don't mind doing that. And we're looking for the blue scissors. And one of the real benefits now of using that magic marker, or the permanent marker, is that we can see through it. So the front I can see is here instead. Right? And that's going to end here. Make sure everything is still lined up. There we go. We're going to add 15 inches. Our seam allowance and where the actual fabric pattern was. There we go. There we go. This is not the back anymore, but the front. And this curve is something like this. And again, we need to add 2 inches to the top of this. For the elastic. So then the only other thing we need to figure out is where do the pockets go? Because you can't have PJs without pockets. It's a crime, especially if you're making them yourself, right? So if I take a look at the pants I'm wearing, the top of the pockets is at about 3 to 4 inches down from the waistline. And so I want to do the same thing here. At about 3.5, 4 inches down is where I want my pocket to start. So right about there. And I'll just set markings there to remind me. So that's at 3.5 inches there. And on this side. Pocket. And I'm going to do the same thing on the back side. And again, the nice thing about using a paper like this is I know that these are going to line up. And I can just copy right through the paper. I can verify if I want to, however, just to check. And it's a good thing I did, because the top of this is actually here at this curve. There we go. And the pocket will be at 3.5 inches. Right here. Good deal. Okay, so I need to add 2 inches to the top of this curve, 2 inches to the top of the front curve, and about 15 inches to the bottom of the back and the front when I do the cutting of the fabric. However, before I go and cut the fabric, I'm gonna cut these patterns out, right? So, as I said before, I'm not going to bore you with the cutting of paper and the cutting of fabric, unless that's something that you're really interested in seeing, because that takes me quite a while. So this is where I'm going to cut this stream, as it were. Cutting fabric, cutting patterns, cutting streams. It seems appropriate. So I'm going to cut these out. I'm going to pick a fabric, I'm going to cut that out, and then when I come back, when I'm ready for sewing, we'll go through the process. I'll show you where everything was marked, and I'll kind of go over that process of how the cutting was done so that we don't have to do that, in stream. Thank you, Trinity. I appreciate that so much. And what we're really left with is just 3 little pattern pieces, right? So let me mark for myself then that this is the pocket. This is PJ bottoms. A back. I need to cut 2 of them, right? And the same thing on the other. And this is going to help me identify this pattern when I want to use it again. Now, the pocket, I'm not labeling this as a PJ pocket because this is kind of a universal pocket. If I want to use this pocket in a skirt or in pants or really anywhere else that's along a seam line, you could throw this pocket anywhere. So I'm just going to call it a pocket, and I'm going to leave it at that. And I'll show you how to throw all of these together on the next sewing stream. That one will probably be quite a bit longer. This was just a really quick draft for how do I take something I've already got and recreate it. And so the next time we'll go through and put this pattern to work. So PJ bottoms. Front, I want to cut 2 of them. Now remember, when you cut these, that they are sided, right? So the front and the back, you need to cut it once this way and once upside down, right? So I'll go over the intricacies of that later on when we've got the fabric in front of us. So that'll be the next stream. But remember that you need a left leg and a right leg and a front and a back of each of those. So thank you so much for hanging out. Thank you for chilling. I hope the music was okay. I know that it didn't post correctly, so hopefully this stream stays up and the company that I used for this royalty-free music won't come after me. We'll see how that goes. But thank you all. I hope that you all are taking care of yourselves. I hope that you are staying hydrated. I hope that you're breathing through the jump scares life throws your way. And I hope that you have a wonderful day, night, evening, afternoon, whatever it happens to be, wherever you are in the world. I'll be back again this weekend to finish sewing this, as well as to play another mod of Portal called Rexaura. I don't know how long that will take, but I will be doing that again at some point this weekend, either Saturday or Sunday. I haven't worked out the specifics yet, but I will see you all again soon. Take care of yourselves. Bye.